Chapter 1. The village of Pendleford lay nestled between two green hills, its winding lanes lined with cottages whose gardens spilled over with roses, sweet peas and lavender. Life here moved at the rhythm of the church bells, steady and predictable, marked by the arrival of the post-cart and the gossip at the tea-shop. Yet beneath its tranquil surface, as Miss Jane Marple well knew, human nature was forever weaving little drama, and sometimes tragedies. On an autumn morning touched with the crispness of October, the peace of Pendleford was broken by a most alarming discovery. The bell above the door of Larkin's Clockmakers, a narrow shop on the High Street, gave a half-hearted jangle as Mr. Alfred Larkin, the proprietor, stepped inside to begin his day. He was a punctual man, as befitted one whose livelihood depended on the measurement of time, and he prided himself on unlocking the door at precisely 8 o'clock. That morning, however, his key turned sluggishly in the lock, as if someone had tried it before him. Inside, the shop smelled faintly odd, a tang not of oil and brass polish, but something heavier, metallic. The rows of ticking clocks from mantelpieces to grandfather cases marked the silence in a chorus both soothing and unnerving. It was there, by the tall case clock near the counter, that Mr. Larkin gave a cry. For sprawled upon the worn wooden floor, his head twisted at an unnatural angle, lay the body of a man. His eyes stared glassily at the ceiling, and on his lips clung the faintest trace of foam. By 9 o'clock, half the village knew of it. By 1:30, the other half was already embellishing the tale. Some said the corpse was a stranger, others swore it was Mr. Pritchard from the next village. At the post office, Mrs. Hogg whispered that he had been struck down in the act of robbery. At the butcher's, Mrs. Price declared he had been poisoned, for he had a look about him, you know. It was Alice, Miss Marple's young maid, who brought the news to her employer. She burst into the neat little sitting-room, cheeks flushed with excitement, the breakfast tray rattling in her hands. "Ma'am, they say there's a dead man in Mr. Larkin's shop." Right on the floor, with the clocks all around, ticking like in a nightmare. Mrs. Hogg says his face was blue, and she heard it from Constable Jarvis himself. Miss Marple, seated with her knitting, raised her pale blue eyes. "Oh, dear me. How very distressing for poor Mr. Larkin. A body in one's shop must be most inconvenient." Alice gaped. "Inconvenient, ma'am? But it's murder." "Perhaps," said Miss Marple gently, "or perhaps not. One mustn't assume, Alice. A sudden death may have many causes. Still, I dare say the truth will come out in due course. Human nature has a way of revealing itself like weeds through gravel." At 11, Miss Marple set out along the lane to the High Street, ostensibly to purchase a spool of cotton. She walked slowly, leaning on her parasol, greeting villagers with her usual mild courtesy. Yet her keen eyes noted the little clusters of gossipers, the nervous glances, the flutter of excitement that always followed calamity in a quiet place. Constable Jarvis, a stout young man with more enthusiasm than experience, stood guard at the door of the clockmaker's shop. He touched his helmet as Miss Marple approached. "Best not to go in, miss," he said. "Inspector Graves is on his way from the county. Very serious matter. The dead man, not from round here, that's for certain. No papers on him, no sign of how he got in." "Very curious," Miss Marple murmured. "And poor Mr. Larkin must be most upset." Inside, voices murmured, Mr. Larkin's anxious tones and another deeper one that Miss Marple recognized as Dr. Travers, the local physician. After a moment, the doctor emerged, his expression grave. He paused when he saw Miss Marple. "Most unusual case," he said softly. "Not a natural death, I fear. There are signs of poison, or perhaps strychnine. The inspector will know more." Miss Marple inclined her head. "How very sad. Poison, you say? That does require a certain kind of mind. Not anger, I think, but calculation and patience." Dr. Travers looked startled, then thoughtful. Yes, indeed, calculation. By the following afternoon, Pendleford was alive with speculation. At the Rose and Crown, the landlord swore he had seen the dead man before. Loitering near Marleycombe Lane, Mrs. Bantry declared he was a Londoner, one of those rough sorts. And Mrs. Pritchard, with relish, insisted it must be connected with the old Chumley estate. For where there's decay, there's trouble. Miss Marple, listening without appearing to, added each remark to her quiet store of knowledge, for she knew that gossip, while embroidered with fancy, often concealed a thread of truth. That evening, as she sat in her cottage, the roses scenting the twilight air, she reflected on the strange event. A corpse in the clockmaker's shop. How symbolic, she thought, of time catching up with secrets long kept. She set aside her knitting, looked out at the quiet lane, and murmured to herself, "Human beings, like clocks, can be wound too tightly, and when that happens, something must break." The steady ticking of her own mantel clock seemed to echo the thought, filling the silence with a promise. This mystery was only just beginning. Chapter 2. Inspector Graves arrived in Pendleford the following morning, a heavy-set man with a square jaw and eyes that rarely betrayed amusement. He had come before on lesser matters, missing hens, petty thefts, but never to find a corpse in a respectable shop. The villagers watched his progress down the high street with eager curiosity, their curtains twitching like restless eyelids. At Larkin's clockmaker's, the blinds were still drawn, and a notice in Mr. Larkin's careful handwriting declared, "Closed until further notice." The inspector pushed past Constable Jarvis, who stood smartly at attention, and surveyed the narrow interior. Clocks of every size ticked steadily, a chorus of time that seemed almost mocking when measured against the silence of death. The body had been removed to the parish hall, laid out for examination. Graves bent low over the scuffed floorboards, noting the faint marks of a struggle, a chair pushed back too far, a small smear on the counter's edge. His gaze shifted to the tall case clock in the corner. Its door stood ajar, the pendulum still swinging, and inside, upon the shelf beneath, lay a scrap of cloth, torn, dark-stained. He pocketed it without a word. By mid-morning, the inspector had summoned Mr. Larkin for questioning. The clockmaker, pale and agitated, twisted his cap between nervous hands. "I swear, sir, I know nothing of it. I locked the shop at 7 sharp, same as always." Next morning, there he was. "I'd never seen him before in my life." "You keep a careful routine?" Graves asked. "Yes, sir. Regular as clockwork, if you'll pardon it. I close, I check the locks, I go home." "My wife will tell you the same." Graves regarded him steadily. "And yet someone entered during the night. Did you leave the window unlatched?" "No, sir." "I'm sure I didn't, unless—" He hesitated, glanced toward the floor. "Well, I did hear something odd last week. A rattle in the back room after hours. Thought it was just the cat." The inspector made a note. "Next time, Mr. Larkin, do not assume. Cats rarely poison strangers." At the back of the hall, quietly knitting, sat Miss Marple. She had attended under the pretext of delivering flowers for the trestle tables, but her presence was neither accidental nor unwelcome. Graves, though not always willing to admit it, had learned to value her eyes and ears. When the questioning ended, she moved softly to his side. "You are puzzled, Inspector?" He grunted. "No identification on the man?" "A London suit, though worn. Pockets empty, too empty. Robbery, perhaps." Yet nothing was taken from the shop itself. "Curious," Miss Marple agreed. "I wonder if he was not robbed at all, but tidied. One removes papers, letters, anything that might connect." The inspector gave her a sharp glance. "And why tidy unless one has something to hide?" "Precisely," said Miss Marple. That evening the village hummed with speculation. At the grocer's, Mrs. Bantry whispered that the dead man must have been a criminal, a burglar caught in the act. At the inn, Ned Booker, already flushed with ale, declared he had seen a stranger lurking by the churchyard only days before, peering about like he was waiting for someone. And Mrs. Pritchard never to be outdone, swore she knew for a fact that Lady Caroline's coach had been seen near the High Street late at night. And you may make of that what you will. Miss Marple listened without protest. In gossip lay both embroidery and outline, and she knew to take note of the pattern rather than the thread. Later, in her quiet cottage, she considered the facts. A stranger found dead, poisoned, in a clockmaker's shop. No money, no papers, and a torn scrap hidden inside a grandfather clock. Time itself seemed to hold the clue. She murmured to herself as her needles clicked. The curious thing about clocks is that they tell more than hours. They tell of patience, of waiting, of secrets measured out in ticks and tocks. One wonders whose time had run out. Outside, the autumn wind stirred the hedges, and in the village of Pendleford, the whispers grew louder. Chapter 3. Inspector Graves took up quarters at the vicarage, a habit of his when cases in small villages demanded more than a day's work. His presence gave Pendleford an air of drama that both alarmed and delighted the inhabitants. The vicar's wife bustled about preparing special dishes to help the inspector think clearly, while the villagers invented theories with the energy of bees in summer. The corpse remained a puzzle. The man's clothes were of good cloth but shabby, his shoes well made but scuffed from travel. There was no name stitched inside, no letter in the pockets, nothing but a half-worn handkerchief of plain linen. Dr. Travers had completed his examination. Death by strychnine, ingested only an hour or two before discovery. The poison worked swiftly, producing contortions that Mr. Larkin would not forget in a hurry. Graves summoned the villagers most closely connected with the shop. Alfred Larkin repeated his story, sweating all the while. His wife, a thin woman with anxious eyes, swore she had been at home with him until morning. A boy from the bakery claimed he had seen a tall stranger pass through the high street after dusk 2 nights before. Each statement added little, yet Graves pressed on methodically. In the snug of the Rose and Crown, the talk grew bolder. Some whispered that the dead man had come to blackmail someone at Marleycombe House, for where else in Pendleford lay secrets worth killing for? Others said the Cholmondeley family had long concealed a scandal, a lost heir, a hidden marriage, and Mrs. Price, ever dramatic, declared she had seen a cloaked figure near the shop at midnight, though her story altered with each retelling. Miss Marple, seated quietly in her corner, sipped barley water and observed. She noted the eagerness with which people embroidered their accounts, the relish with which suspicion settled always upon those of higher station. Yet, within the exaggerations she detected a consistent thread. The stranger had not wandered aimlessly. He had been expected. The following day, Inspector Graves visited Marleycombe House. The long drive was lined with autumn maples, their leaves a blaze of red and gold, but the great house itself showed signs of neglect. Paint peeled from the shutters, ivy clung too thickly, and the air was heavy with decline. Lady Caroline Cholmondeley received him in the drawing-room, dressed in black though she was, mourning no relation. "It is most vexing, Inspector," she declared in her clear, commanding voice, "to have this sordid business connected with Pendleford. Mr. Larkin is a respectable tradesman." "But really to harbour a corpse in his shop?" Graves inclined his head. "The body, madam, did not walk there unaided. We must establish who the man was and why he died where he did." "You are certain you do not recognize him?" "Quite certain." "We do not consort with strangers." Miss Marple, who had come under pretext of delivering knitted shawls for the charity sale, watched Lady Caroline's fingers twist the chain of her locket as she spoke. A tiny gesture, but, in Miss Marple's experience, seldom meaningless. Henry Cholmondeley, Lady Caroline's nephew and heir, entered part way through the interview. He was a tall young man with restless eyes and a manner too quick for comfort. His greeting was polite, yet he avoided the inspector's gaze. Miss Marple noticed his cuff bore a faint smear, as though hastily cleaned. Later, in the garden, Eleanor Chumley, a cousin staying at the house, confided to Miss Marple in low tones. "The whole place is under strain. My aunt will not admit it, but the estate is drowning in debt. If a stranger came with knowledge of old secrets, it might ruin us entirely." Her face flushed. "But please, do not repeat my words," Miss Marple promised, though she knew the inspector would sense as much himself. Murder was seldom about strangers alone. It was about what people feared to have revealed. That evening, Graves considered the evidence by lamplight. The torn cloth he had found in the tall clock proved to be from the lining of a gentleman's coat. Why had it been hidden there, and by whom? The clock had been wound that very week by Larkin himself, yet he denied knowledge of the scrap. At her own hearth, Miss Marple reflected quietly. Clocks mark the passage of time, but they also conceal it. A secret placed behind their ticking may lie undisturbed for years. Yet once found, it cannot be forgotten. The mantel clock in her sitting room chimed 9. To Miss Marple's ear it sounded almost like a warning. Time was running out. For the truth, and perhaps for someone else in Pendleford. Chapter 4. Inspector Graves, though cautious by nature, could not ignore the mounting pressure. A man had been poisoned in the centre of a quiet village, and yet no one could, or would, say who he was. The villagers demanded an arrest, the authorities demanded progress, and through it all, Graves sensed that someone, somewhere in Pendleford, was watching carefully to see which way suspicion turned. He began with the obvious, the shop itself. Mr. Larkin stood by as Graves and Constable Jarvis searched every cupboard, drawer and dusty shelf. They found nothing of immediate significance, only the usual clutter of a craftsman's trade, oil cans, brass polish, tools laid out with meticulous care. Yet Miss Marple, allowed to wander politely about, noticed the smallest of details. One clock on the shelf behind the counter had been wound, but its hands were set back, frozen at 11 minutes past 12. She said nothing, merely tucked the fact into her store of observations. Clocks, she reflected, often told more stories than the hours they marked. By midday, Inspector Graves had returned to the parish hall to examine the dead man's belongings once more. Spread out upon the trestle table were meagre items indeed, the plain handkerchief, the scuffed shoes, a worn suit of decent cut. Nothing at all that might place his name or purpose. But the lining of the coat, once carefully inspected, bore signs of tampering. A pocket had been unpicked and sewn again, recently, clumsily. Something had been hidden there and then removed. Whoever killed him, Graves muttered, was careful to strip away whatever mattered most. That afternoon the inspector called again at Marleycombe House. Lady Caroline received him with her customary hauteur, but there was a nervous edge beneath her composure. Henry Chumley hovered nearby, pacing the carpet, while Eleanor sat with a book unopened in her lap. "Madam," Graves said evenly, "are you quite sure you do not recognize the dead man?" "I have told you, Inspector, I do not, and I resent the implication that my household has anything to do with such sordid affairs." Henry broke in quickly. "My aunt is right. It is absurd to connect us with some vagrant found in a tradesman's shop." His voice trembled just enough to betray the strain. Eleanor glanced up suddenly. "But what if he was not a vagrant?" she said. "What if he came here on purpose?" Lady Caroline's eyes flashed. "Eleanor!" Miss Marple, quietly knitting in her corner, let the scene play out. To her practised eyes, Henry's defensiveness, Lady Caroline's sharpness, and Eleanor's anxious candour painted a family under considerable pressure. Debt, scandal, fear. These were motives as potent as any greed. That evening, as the wind rattled the shutters of her cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire and considered. If the stranger had come to Marleycombe with some knowledge, something worth killing for, then someone there had a very good reason to see him silenced. And if he had been lured into the clockmaker's shop, poisoned and left, then the murder was no act of chance. The following morning brought fresh rumour. At the Rose and Crown, Ned Booker claimed he had seen the stranger speaking with a woman in a dark cloak near the churchyard days before. Mrs. Price insisted the woman was Eleanor, though she admitted freely that she had only caught a glimpse from behind. By the time the story reached the butcher's, Eleanor had been seen passing the man a letter, and by the post office it was said she had handed him money. Miss Marple knew better than to take gossip at face value, yet she also knew that such tales did not arise from nothing. Someone, somewhere, had seen something, though not necessarily what they thought. Inspector Graves, faced with the growing talk, questioned Eleanor directly. She denied ever speaking to a stranger, though her eyes flickered nervously. I walk often in the evening, she admitted.
Sometimes near the churchyard. But I never met anyone there, truly. The inspector pressed no further, though he noted her unease.
Later he confided to Miss Marple, "The girl is frightened. Whether of guilt or of her family, I cannot yet tell." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "People are often frightened of both, Inspector. But fear, like poison, shows itself if you wait long enough." That night, alone in her cottage, Miss Marple thought again of the clock in Mr. Larkin's shop. Its hands stopped at 11 minutes past 12. Why had someone set it so?
To mark a time? To leave a message?
Or merely by accident? She shook her head gently. Human beings rarely did things by pure chance. Somewhere behind that small detail lay intent. Outside, the autumn moon shone pale over Pendleford. In the cottages, whispers continued. The villagers sensed the truth, though they could not name it. A secret hung over them, heavy as a storm, and Jane Marple, quiet in her chair, resolved that she would see it revealed before another clock marked another death. Chapter 5. Inspector Graves was up early the next morning, striding along the high street with determination. The villagers fell silent as he passed, each whispering after him. He went straight to the clockmaker's shop once more, with Mr. Larkin reluctantly unlocking the door at his side. The smell of oil and brass polish clung to the air, but beneath it still lingered that faint metallic tang. Graves crouched by the tall case clock again. "This business with the hands set at 11 past 12, he muttered, "is no accident. A message, perhaps."
Or the time of death. He tapped the face lightly.
Yet Dr. Travers insists the man died between midnight and 2. Too wide a margin. Miss Marple, who had found a perfectly polite excuse to be nearby, leaned in. "Sometimes, Inspector, people leave signals not for the police, but for those who already understand them."
A code, if you like.
One wonders who in Pendleford would read such a thing correctly. Graves grunted.
A fair question, Miss Marple.
And one, I mean, to answer. By mid-morning, he had summoned Henry Chumley to the parish hall. Henry appeared restless, his tie askew, his eyes darting about. Graves showed him the scrap of cloth from the clock. "Does this mean anything to you?" Henry frowned. "Why should it? Looks like nothing to me." But his voice cracked slightly, betraying unease. After he had gone, Miss Marple remarked quietly, "When a young man insists too quickly, Inspector, it often means he has not had time to think of a better lie." Meanwhile, gossip in the village grew louder. Mrs. Bantry claimed she had it on excellent authority that the dead man was once a servant at Marleycombe. Dismissed in disgrace years ago, Mrs. Price countered that he was a long-lost relative come to claim an inheritance. By the time the tale reached the postmistress, he had become a blackmailer, demanding hush money from Lady Caroline herself. Miss Marple listened as Alice repeated these stories breathlessly over the tea tray that evening. She smiled faintly. "People so enjoy embroidery, Alice, but one must look for the original cloth beneath." That night, Inspector Graves ordered a more thorough search of Marleycombe House. With Lady Caroline's grudging consent, he and Constable Jarvis combed the east wing, long closed and smelling of dust. Behind a cupboard, they discovered a stack of old ledgers and correspondence. Many were routine household accounts, but within them lay letters addressed to Lady Caroline's late husband, stamped with London seals, and one torn envelope bearing the name of a solicitor. Graves studied them with interest. "Debts," he murmured, "and disputes. The estate is not as secure as her ladyship pretends." Miss Marple, peering at the brittle pages, nodded slowly. "Money troubles, family pride, old secrets."
One finds such things are often the soil in which murder grows. The inspector tucked the papers away.
"If our dead man knew of these, he may well have threatened exposure. That could give us motive aplenty." The following day, Eleanor was seen walking alone by the river, her face pale, her eyes shadowed. Miss Marple approached gently, her manner grandmotherly and kind. "My dear, you look troubled." "A burden shared is a burden halved, they say." Eleanor shook her head.
"I cannot speak, Miss Marple."
"There are things that would ruin us all if they were known. Mr. Blenkins was not the only one who kept watch at Marleycombe." She pressed her handkerchief to her lips. "But please ask me no more." Miss Marple laid a comforting hand on her arm. "I quite understand, my dear. And yet you must be careful. Secrets have a way of demanding their own release. Best it be done gently before someone tears them wide open." That evening, as the village lamps glowed against the autumn dusk, Inspector Graves considered his case. A poisoned man, no name, no papers, a family in debt, a house full of hidden letters, and a nephew too quick to deny. Each piece suggested a picture, but the picture was not yet whole. Miss Marple, in her own cottage, added another stitch to her knitting and thought quietly, "One does not poison for anger.
One poisons for fear."
And in Pendleford, there is fear enough to fill every clock in Mr. Larkin's shop. The ticking of her mantel clock echoed in the silence, steady, relentless, like time itself moving toward revelation. Chapter 6. Inspector Graves's patience was wearing thin. The villagers grew more restless each day, and Marleycombe's grandeur could not conceal the undercurrent of dread. In the parlour of the vicarage, Graves laid out his notes by lamplight, the pages filled with questions, but precious few answers. Miss Marple, seated nearby with her knitting, offered her quiet commentary as though discussing the weather. "Murder, Inspector, is so rarely an act of impulse. Poison especially, it takes knowledge, preparation, and a most particular state of mind," Graves grunted.
"A state of mind we've not yet pinned on anyone."
Larkin denies all. Henry Chumley squirms like an eel. Eleanor trembles at shadows, and Lady Caroline looks down her nose at me as though I were a tradesman come to collect the bill. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. "Bills, Inspector, are often at the heart of such matters. People will go to surprising lengths to avoid paying them." So that afternoon, a new commotion stirred the village. Mrs. Larkin, the clockmaker's wife, collapsed suddenly after drinking a cordial at the grocer's. Though she survived, Dr. Travers confirmed the drink bore traces of digitalis, the very poison that had killed the stranger. The village buzzed with renewed alarm. Was there another would-be victim? Or had someone intended the cordial for another and Mrs. Larkin taken it by chance? Inspector Graves tightened his net, ordering the sergeant to question every vendor and neighbour. Yet each denied knowledge, and no one admitted to seeing the cordial tampered with. At the Rose and Crown that evening, tongues wagged with gusto.
Ned Booker swore the Chumley servants were sneaking about after dark, carrying parcels from the house. Mrs. Bantry declared she had seen Eleanor crying in the churchyard with a letter clenched in her hand.
By the time the tale reached Mrs. Pritchard at the post office, Eleanor had been overheard confessing murder to the vicar himself, though the vicar, when asked, looked most bewildered. Miss Marple sat quietly in her corner, sipping barley water. She thought of Mrs. Larkin's collapse and of the deliberate hand required to prepare such a poison. Impulsive quarrels were one thing, but carefully measured powders were another. Someone in Pendleford was willing to kill again to keep a secret buried. The following morning, Inspector Graves and Miss Marple returned to Marleycombe House. Lady Caroline received them in the library, where portraits of grim-faced ancestors stared down in judgment. Graves produced the letters he had found in the East Wing. "These suggest serious debts, my lady. Could the dead man have known of them?" Lady Caroline's lips thinned. "My household affairs are no concern of yours. Blenkins was a faithful servant. He would never have betrayed us." Henry, standing near the fire, snapped, "We cannot be blamed for every misfortune in this village. The man was a stranger. Why should we care?" His vehemence only deepened the inspector's suspicion. Eleanor, pale and hesitant, looked at Miss Marple with pleading eyes, but again she said nothing. Afterward, as they walked down the gravel drive, Graves muttered, "They're hiding something, all right. The question is, was the stranger their enemy or their kin?" Miss Marple replied gently, "Family, Inspector. Can be both." That evening, Miss Marple reviewed all she knew. A poisoned stranger, a clock set to a curious time, a scrap of cloth, debts concealed in dusty ledgers, and now an attempted second poisoning. She remembered cases from her youth, domestic disputes, inheritances, jealousies, always the same pattern beneath the surface. Fear drove people as much as greed, and fear was heavy in Pendleford. She laid aside her knitting and gazed at the mantel clock. The steady ticking filled the room, patient, inexorable. Somewhere in those beats lay the truth. Someone's time was running short, and Miss Marple meant to see whose it was before another glass of cordial carried another soul into silence. Chapter 7. Inspector Graves had not slept well. The attempted poisoning of Mrs. Larkin had unsettled the village and cast a darker shadow over Pendleford. By morning, the inspector's jaw was set, his eyes red from too little rest, and his notebook fuller than ever yet, no closer to a conclusion. At the breakfast table of the vicarage, he spoke grimly. "Someone here is desperate, Miss Marple. They silenced the stranger and now have tried again, either to frighten or to eliminate a witness. I will not allow this village to become a hunting ground." Miss Marple poured tea with her usual serenity. "When one cannot frighten away the truth, Inspector, one often tries to bury it under fear. But fear spreads. It makes people careless." She added sugar to her cup and stirred gently. "You may find our poisoner grows less subtle with each attempt." That morning, Graves summoned Alfred Larkin to the parish hall once more. The poor man trembled, twisting his cap in his hands. "My wife's near dead, Inspector."
Who'd want to harm her?
"We've done nothing to anyone." Graves leaned forward. "Your shop is at the centre of this business, Mr. Larkin. A man dies there, your wife nearly follows."
Are you certain you know nothing of the stranger?
Larkin shook his head vehemently. "Never seen him before in my life. And as for that clock you keep asking, I didn't set no hands to any hour."
I wind them, true enough, but I never altered that one.
Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, asked in her gentle way, "Do you ever lend out the keys to the shop, Mr. Larkin, even for a short while?" The man hesitated, then admitted, "Once or twice Henry Chumley borrowed them, said he needed to fetch repairs."
And Mr. Blenkins, before he died, he had a set.
"Used to come check the old carriage clocks. Said he liked to keep his hand in." Inspector Graves's eyes sharpened.
Blenkins had a set of keys?
"Yes, sir."
I never thought it harm. Graves made a note.
"You may go, Mr. Larkin. Keep close watch on your wife, and tell no one else of what you've said." Later that day, word spread that Eleanor Chumley had been seen in tears outside the church. Mrs. Price declared she had been praying as if for her soul. And Mrs. Bantry swore she carried a sealed envelope clutched in her hand. By the time the tale wound its way to the Rose and Crown, Eleanor had confessed to murdering the stranger, though no one could agree upon the reason. Miss Marple walked up to Marleycombe House that afternoon. She found Eleanor in the garden, pale and trembling. "My dear," Miss Marple said kindly, "rumour runs through Pendleford like ivy on an old wall."
"You must not let it strangle you." Eleanor's hands twisted in her lap. "I cannot speak, Miss Marple."
"If I tell what I know, my family will be ruined. But if I remain silent, more may die. What am I to do?" Miss Marple patted her hand. "The truth, Eleanor, is rather like a weed. You may cover it, but it will find its way to the light. Better to guide it gently than to let it tear through the stonework." Eleanor sobbed quietly, but said no more. Inspector Graves, meanwhile, pursued another angle. He tracked the source of the digitalis. Foxglove grew wild in many gardens, but to prepare it as poison required knowledge. A chemist in the next town confirmed that a woman, he could not say who, for she wore a veil, had purchased certain tinctures weeks earlier, tinctures that could be turned to deadly purpose. When Graves reported this to Miss Marple, she nodded thoughtfully. "A woman's hand, then?"
"It fits, Inspector."
"Poison is rarely the weapon of men. It requires patience, planning, and a calm heart, or a very desperate one." That evening, Graves confronted Lady Caroline directly. He laid the chemist's statement upon her escritoire. She glanced at it once, her face unmoved. "I buy tonics for my household regularly. Nothing unusual in that. Tonics strong enough to kill?" The inspector pressed. Her eyes flashed. "I do not like your insinuations, Inspector. My family has stood in this county for generations. We will not be disgraced by idle talk." Miss Marple, present with her knitting in hand, said softly, "It is not idle talk, my lady, when a man lies dead and a woman nearly joined him. Pride is a fine armour, but even armour cracks under poison." Lady Caroline rose, her dignity intact but her colour high.
"I will not be questioned further." She swept from the room. Henry, left behind, muttered furiously, "You hound us like criminals. Can't you see?"
"My aunt suffers enough. The estate is failing, the debts are crushing, we have no need of scandal on top." Inspector Graves regarded him steadily. "Then help me find the truth, Mr. Chumley, for the scandal of murder will sink Marleycombe far deeper than debt." Henry said nothing, only turned sharply and left. That night, as the wind rattled Miss Marple's cottage windows, she considered what she had seen. Lady Caroline proud, Henry desperate, Eleanor fearful, the Larkins frightened, a stranger dead, a cup overturned, a clock with its hands set at 12:11. She recalled Eleanor's words. "If I tell what I know, my family will be ruined." "Ruined families," Miss Marple murmured, "produce desperate acts, and desperate acts produce corpses." Her clock chimed 10, the sound echoing in the small parlour. She sat very still, her knitting in her lap. Time was running on, and the poisoner's hand had not yet finished its work. Another attempt, she was certain, would come, and when it did, she meant to be ready. Chapter 8. The air in Pendleford grew heavy with unease. The villagers went about their tasks, but voices lowered as Inspector Graves passed, and doors closed a little too quickly. Murder and poison had made their mark. The peace of the village seemed broken, as though every ticking clock whispered a warning. Miss Marple, taking her usual slow walk along the lane, observed faces in windows, curtains drawn, and small knots of gossip breaking apart when she approached. To some she was the kindly old lady with her knitting and soft voice, to others something far more unsettling, the one who always saw what others missed. That morning, Inspector Graves called on Dr. Travers again. The coroner's further report confirmed what they had feared. The stranger had not only ingested digitalis, but bore traces of another substance, perhaps laudanum, that suggested he had been drugged before the poison took effect. So he was subdued first, Graves mused, to make sure he swallowed the final draught. Whoever did this wanted no chance of failure. Miss Marple inclined her head. A careful hand indeed, one that measures not only powders but also outcomes. Such a person does not kill in heat, Inspector, but in cold resolve. Graves snapped his notebook shut. And such a person still walks among us. Later that day, a discovery shook the case forward. Constable Jarvis, combing through the east wing at Marleycombe once more, uncovered a locked drawer within an old escritoire. Inside lay letters, charred at the edges as though someone had tried to burn them. The writing was still legible enough, a solicitor's correspondence, mentioning an inheritance claim against the Chumley estate. The name affixed to the claim was smudged by smoke, but enough remained to read, Thomas Brackley. Thomas Brackley, Graves repeated aloud.
So our corpse has a name. Miss Marple's eyes brightened with recognition.
Brackley.
Yes, I remember.
Years ago at the big house, there was talk of a footman by that name. Dismissed under a cloud, though the exact nature of it was never spoken. He would have been middle-aged now. Yes, it could be him. The inspector nodded grimly. So Brackley returns, armed with knowledge of the estate's weakness, and someone silences him before he can speak. Rumour spread swiftly. At the grocer's, Mrs. Bantry declared Brackley had been Lady Caroline's secret cousin, disowned for scandal. At the butcher's, he became Henry's illegitimate father, come to claim rights. By the time Mrs. Pritchard heard it at the post office, Brackley was said to have been Eleanor's suitor, threatening to expose some disgrace. Miss Marple, overhearing as she purchased her knitting wool, only smiled faintly. So many tales, she murmured, yet each clings to the Chumley name. Where there is smoke, there is often fire, though one must choose carefully which chimney it comes from. That evening, Inspector Graves pressed Henry Chumley hard. He laid the letters on the table. Henry turned pale. So it's true, Brackley came back.
I thought it only rumour. Rumour?
Graves barked. You knew he was here?
Henry stammered. I saw him once, near the gate.
He said he wanted to speak with my aunt.
I told him to go.
He muttered something about debts, about rights that were his.
He broke off, glancing at his aunt's stern gaze. Lady Caroline's voice was icy.
You said nothing of this before, Henry. How very foolish of you. Miss Marple's eyes rested quietly on Lady Caroline. She noted the faint tremor of her hand against her pearls. The following night, another attempt was made. A bottle of port set aside in the vicarage cellar was discovered tampered with, its dark liquid laced with the bitter tang of foxglove. By chance, the vicar himself had noticed the altered cork before serving it to his guests. Inspector Graves swore furiously. His poisoner is bold, Miss Marple. To tamper in the very house of God. They mean to sow terror, Miss Marple calmer said, or perhaps to silence one particular voice among the many. The vicar is discreet, but he hears more than most. Confessions, Inspector, come in many forms, Graves frowned. If only we knew whose confession he had. Meanwhile, Eleanor sought Miss Marple privately. The girl's eyes were red with weeping. Miss Marple, I cannot bear it. Mr. Brackley was my uncle, my father's brother. He claimed the estate was rightfully his, that my father had cheated him of inheritance. He begged me to intercede with my aunt.
I promised to speak, but before I could, he was dead. Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on hers.
And so you fear your silence condemned him. But remember, my dear, guilt is often claimed by the innocent, while the guilty walk free until someone points the finger. Eleanor trembled. I'm afraid, Miss Marple.
Afraid of what my aunt will do if the truth comes out?
She guards the family name as though it were a crown. Indeed, Miss Marple murmured, and crowns, as history shows, are often bought with blood. Inspector Graves gathered his suspects the next evening in the vicarage hall. Lady Caroline, Henry, Eleanor, the Larkins, even Ned Booker. He spoke gravely of evidence, of Brackley's name, of debts and poisoned bottles. But Miss Marple, seated quietly at the back, saw more than words. She saw Lady Caroline's lips press thin at every mention of Brackley, Henry's restless movements betraying fear of exposure, Eleanor's pale guilt, and Mr. Larkin's twitching hands. She remembered, 2. The clock set at 11 past 12. She thought suddenly of railway timetables, of trains arriving from London just after noon. Had Brackley arrived on such a train? Had the time been set as a sign? If so, to whom? That night, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and sat very still by the fire. The pattern was nearly complete. A man with a claim, a family with debts, poison measured out with cold calculation. The threads all wove back to Marley Combe. She spoke softly into the quiet room, as though to herself. Brackley knew too much. Someone feared ruin more than they feared murder, and pride, in the end, is the deadliest poison of all. Her clock struck midnight, the sound echoing like a knell. Miss Marple folded her knitting carefully and prepared herself. The time for patient watching was nearly done. Soon the hour would come to lay bare the truth before every eye in Pendleford. Chapter 9. Pendleford awoke under a low, grey sky. The village green damp with mist and the chimneys breathing thin threads of smoke. People walked quickly, glancing over their shoulders, as though the air itself carried menace. No one could forget that a stranger had been poisoned, that Mrs. Larkin had nearly met the same fate, and that even the vicar's port had been tainted. Inspector Graves stood at the centre of the storm. He had summoned his suspects again, but this time his patience was thinner, his voice sharper. "We have a name now, Thomas Brackley," he announced, his eyes scanning Lady Caroline, Henry, and Eleanor. "A man with a claim on Marley Combe, armed with letters and prepared to use them. Someone here feared him enough to kill." Lady Caroline sat tall, her gloved hands folded, face an unmoving mask. Henry shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting. Eleanor stared at the floor, pale and trembling. Graves continued. "The poisoner is clever, but their hand grows careless. The cordial for Mrs. Larkin, the port in the vicarage, attempts to frighten or silence, but each one leaves traces. I will find them, and when I do, the law will not be lenient." From the back of the hall, Miss Marple's quiet voice floated forward. "The law must wait, Inspector. But character, you see, reveals itself long before judgment is passed." Graves glanced at her, then nodded curtly.
"Perhaps, Miss Marple, you would enlighten us."
She smiled faintly and returned to her knitting. "Not yet, Inspector. Threads must be tied before they form a pattern." That afternoon, Henry was seen by Mrs. Bantry striding angrily down the lane, muttering to himself. By evening the story had grown. Henry had been overheard confessing to pushing poison into Brackley's glass. By nightfall the tale reached the Rose and Crown, where Ned Booker declared that Henry had bought foxglove from him only a week before, in exchange for coin. Inspector Graves pounced on the rumour, dragging Henry into questioning once more. "I did no such thing,"
Henry burst out.
"Yes, I spoke to Brackley. He wanted money, always money. I told him to leave. That's all." Graves leaned across the table. "And when he threatened to expose your family's debts, did you fear your inheritance might vanish?"
"Enough to slip poison into his drink."
Henry went pale, but his chin lifted stubbornly. "I swear on my life I did not." Miss Marple, watching from her corner, noted the tremble in his hand and the way his eyes flicked toward the door, as though expecting rescue. Not guilt, she thought quietly, but fear. Fear of someone else. Eleanor, meanwhile, grew increasingly fragile. She sought Miss Marple's counsel one evening, her eyes red with tears. "I cannot bear it, Miss Marple. The whispers, the looks, they all think Henry guilty, but it was not him."
"I know it." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand upon hers.
"What troubles you, my dear, is not merely fear for Henry, but fear of what lies beneath. Secrets have a way of poisoning the air until one feels suffocated," Eleanor whispered. "Brackley carried more than letters. He had proof, documents, names. He said my father cheated him of inheritance, that Lady Caroline knew and covered it. He begged me to persuade her. And now he is dead." Miss Marple studied her.
"And so you think your aunt silenced him?"
Eleanor shuddered. She would do anything to protect the family honor. Anything. Inspector Graves, armed with Eleanor's suspicions, returned to Marley Combe. He confronted Lady Caroline in the library, spreading the charred letters before her. "You feared ruin," he said bluntly. "Brackley came with claims, and you silenced him with poison. Your household tonics, your pride in secrecy, they fit too neatly." Lady Caroline's gaze was icy. "Inspector, your accusations are offensive."
"I am a woman of standing. I do not crawl with criminals." "Standing does not shield you from the law," Graves snapped.
"Brackley's blood is on someone's hands in this house, and yours are not so clean as you pretend." She rose in outrage, sweeping from the room. Graves muttered to Miss Marple, "She's hiding something." "I can feel it." Miss Marple's eyes were thoughtful. "Yes, Inspector. Pride conceals, but it also betrays." "Watch her closely." That night, another attempt confirmed Miss Marple's fears. Constable Jarvis, making his rounds, discovered a small vial hidden in the church vestry. It bore the bitter scent of foxglove. Fresh traces marked its lip. Someone had planned another poisoning. Graves clenched his fists. The poisoner grows desperate. "We must act before another life is taken." Miss Marple gazed at the vial. "Desperation, Inspector, often comes when the truth is too close for comfort. And desperation, unlike patience, leaves clear footprints." The next morning, the village gathered uneasily on the green. Graves announced the discovery of Brackley's identity, the inheritance claim, and the attempts at further poisonings. Villagers murmured, heads turning toward Marleycombe. Suspicion was now open, no longer whispered. Henry stood stiffly, anger in his eyes. Eleanor wept quietly. Lady Caroline maintained her mask, but the faintest tremor in her hands betrayed her composure. Miss Marple, observing, saw what others missed. She saw Henry's fear, Eleanor's guilt, and Lady Caroline's pride. She saw how each spoke of Brackley with different tones, anger, sorrow, disdain, and she remembered the clock's hands at 12:11, a message meant for someone who would understand. "Time," she whispered to herself. "It is always about time, and the one who fears it most is the one who set it." That evening in her cottage, Miss Marple set aside her knitting and looked at the fire. The threads were nearly tied. Brackley had returned to claim what he believed was his. Someone had feared exposure enough to plan his death. Someone had measured powders with a steady hand, not once, but thrice. She thought of Lady Caroline, her obsession with family honor. She thought of the chemist's veiled customer. She thought of Eleanor's whispered fears and Henry's trembling denials. "Yes," she murmured softly. "It is nearly time." The clock on her mantel struck 11. Its chime echoed in the small parlour, steady, relentless, a summons to truth. Miss Marple folded her knitting neatly. Tomorrow, she resolved, the pattern would be revealed, and Pendleford would know the poisoner who walked among them. Chapter 10. The following day dawned sharp and bright, as though the weather itself sought to sweep away the village's heavy dread. Yet Pendleford did not awaken in peace. Curtains twitched, voices whispered, and the church bells tolled not for a service, but as a reminder that time, relentless and impartial, moved steadily forward. Inspector Graves had decided, enough fragments, enough half-truths. He summoned everyone of consequence to the vicarage hall, Lady Caroline, Henry, Eleanor, the Larkins, Ned Booker, even Mrs. Bantry, who, though not strictly a suspect, had spread enough rumours to earn a place at the gathering. He wished to bring all shadows into one room and expose the truth beneath the light. Miss Marple, seated primly at the side with her knitting, understood. This was the moment she had anticipated. The threads of character and circumstance had tightened. All that remained was to tie them into a pattern and reveal it to every eye. The gathering. The villagers arrived one by one, each carrying a weight of tension. Lady Caroline entered with her head high, gloved hands steady, though her eyes glittered like flint. Henry followed, pale and restless, his fingers twitching at his cuffs. Eleanor came last, eyes lowered, clutching her handkerchief as if it were her only shield. Alfred Larkin looked cowed and fearful, his wife pale but recovering, leaning on his arm. Ned Booker slouched in the corner, suspicious and defensive, muttering that he had no business being there. Mrs. Bantry bustled in with evident relish, whispering to Mrs. Price that something dramatic was surely about to happen. Inspector Graves stood at the front, shoulders square, jaw firm. "We are gathered," he said, his voice carrying over the hush, "to face the truth of what has happened in Pendleford. Thomas Brackley, a man with claims against Marleycombe, was murdered in cold blood. Since then, 2 further attempts at poisoning have occurred. It ends here." A murmur rippled through the room. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. She had not spoken yet, but her presence commanded attention nonetheless. The inspector's case Graves laid out the evidence: the paper cup with residue, the chemist's testimony of a veiled woman purchasing tinctures, the charred letters found in the East Wing, the repeated attempts at poisoning, the vial discovered in the church vestry. Piece by piece he wove them into a net. Someone here sought to silence Brackley, he concluded, and then sought to silence others who might reveal the truth. Pride, debt, fear, these are the motives, and the weapon was poison, chosen for its quiet efficiency. He turned to Henry. "You quarrelled with Brackley. You feared his claims."
"Villagers say you purchased foxglove," Henry burst out. "It's not true."
"I quarrelled, yes, but I did not kill him."
"I swear it."
Graves's eyes narrowed. "Then perhaps your aunt, Lady Caroline, she had the most to lose."
"Pride in family name, reputation, the honour of Marleycombe."
"Enough to drive her to poison." Lady Caroline's lips curved into a cold smile. "Do you truly believe I would stoop so low, Inspector? That I, Caroline Cholmondeley, would scurry about with bottles and powders like a common criminal?" Her words dripped with disdain, yet her hand, twisting her pearls, betrayed her. Miss Marple speaks. At last, Miss Marple set aside her knitting. Her soft voice carried clearly in the tense room. "Inspector, if I may."
"You see, this matter is not solved by evidence alone. Evidence can be planted, can be misunderstood."
"But character, Inspector, never lies. And I have always believed that if one understands character, one understands crime." All eyes turned to her. Lady Caroline's gaze hardened. Henry shifted uneasily. Eleanor clutched her handkerchief tighter. Miss Marple continued, "Poison is not the weapon of passion.
It is the weapon of patience, of calculation, of someone who fears scandal more than conscience."
We may dismiss poor Mr. Booker. He has neither the knowledge nor the subtlety. Mr. Larkin is timid, his wife a victim. Henry, for all his faults, is too hot-blooded, too impulsive to measure doses and wait upon death." She paused, her eyes settling on Lady Caroline.
But pride, Inspector, can steady a hand where rage would tremble."
"Pride can silence conscience." "Lady Caroline, it was you who killed Thomas Brackley." The denial, the room gasped. Lady Caroline rose swiftly, her face pale but her bearing still regal. "This is an outrage,"
she snapped. "I will not sit here and be slandered by an old busybody."
"I demand this meeting be ended at once." But Miss Marple's gaze did not waver. "You purchased the tinctures yourself, did you not? Veiled, of course, but not so well disguised as you imagined. The chemist remembered your bearing, and you knew of Brackley's return, knew that he carried documents proving his claim. You set the clock in the shop as a signal, 12:11, the time of his arrival from London. You meant to meet him there, but you gave him not reconciliation, only poison." Lady Caroline trembled, then steadied herself. "You have no proof." "Proof enough," Miss Marple said gently. "The pride in your voice whenever Brackley's name was mentioned, the fear hidden in Eleanor's eyes, the rage in Henry's. But only you, Lady Caroline, had the patience and the motive. You have always lived for Marleycombe, for its name and standing. To you, one life meant little compared to its preservation." The confession silence fell. Then Eleanor broke it with a sob.
It's true, Aunt Caroline, it's true, isn't it?
You told me you would protect us at any cost. You said Brackley's lies would ruin us. And then he was dead. Lady Caroline's shoulders sagged. For the first time, her proud figure seemed diminished. Her dignity cracked. She whispered, "He would have destroyed us. Everything my family has stood for, everything we have endured, it would all have crumbled."
I could not allow it. Henry stared in horror. Aunt, how could you?
She turned to him with cold finality. "For you, Henry, for Eleanor, for Marleycombe."
I did what was necessary. Inspector Graves stepped forward, his voice grim.
"Necessary or not, my lady, it was murder."
And the law will see it so. Aftermath, the villagers whispered, as Lady Caroline was led away.
Pride had carried her for decades, but pride had also destroyed her. Marleycombe stood, but its mistress was disgraced. Henry buried his face in his hands. Eleanor wept openly, her guilt easing into sorrow.
Alfred Larkin clutched his wife close, relieved that their nightmare was over.
Ned Booker muttered that he had known it all along, though no one listened. Mrs. Bantry sighed with satisfaction, already shaping the tale she would tell at every gathering for years to come. Inspector Graves exhaled heavily.
It is done. He turned to Miss Marple.
"Once again, madam, you have seen what none of us could." "My thanks," Miss Marple smiled gently. "One merely has to understand human nature, Inspector. Murder is very rare, but the motives for it, love, fear, pride, and greed, are everywhere."
Here it was pride.
"A most respectable motive, and therefore the most dangerous." Epilogue. Pendleford slowly returned to its routines. The clockmaker's shop reopened, its chimes once more marking the hours. Yet villagers glanced uneasily at the tall case clocks as though each might conceal another secret. At Marleycombe, silence reigned. Without Lady Caroline's formidable presence, the house seemed less grand, more vulnerable. Henry busied himself with accounts. Eleanor tried to hold her head high, but the shadow of scandal lingered. Miss Marple, in her quiet cottage, resumed her knitting. Visitors often remarked upon her calm, but behind her eyes lay the memory of Lady Caroline's broken whisper, "I did what was necessary." She knew, as she had always known, that beneath the surface of respectability lay the same passions as anywhere else. Murder, she reflected, was not born of hate alone. More often it came from love twisted into fear, from pride twisted into desperation. Her clock chimed the hour. She smiled faintly. Time, inexorable and impartial, had revealed the truth at last.